All right, hello everyone. Today we are talking about communication accommodation theory. In short, what this theory talks about is the way in which we change our communication behavior in order to accommodate individuals when they are not fully understanding what it is we're trying to tell them. All right, this could happen with things like accents, changing vocabulary or dialects. People from different parts of the United States, for instance, there might have different words for different parts of life, and therefore you need to accommodate by sort of changing your vocabulary. We try to fit in with certain in groups by changing the way we speak or changing the way we behave, and also we signal to individuals that they are not a part of our groups when we question their language or their behavior. All right. So there's all these small ways that we change our language and our behavior, our communication strategies, in order to sort of set parameters for in groups and out groups. It can go across language barriers. So, for instance, if I'm using certain language to a non-native English speaker, I might need to change vocabulary or sort of shorten up sentences and syntax for someone who is just learning the English language in order so that they can understand what I'm saying, right? But even within native English speakers, let's say, there are ways in which we change our language, our dialect, in order to sort of fit into in groups and out groups, in order to accommodate those who might be of a different generation or a different background with regard to trying to communicate, to share messages. All right, so that's communication accommodation theory in a nutshell. Let's give some examples. So there's this book called To Kill a Mockingbird. Hopefully you've read this. You probably read it in junior high. It's a book that people read fairly early. If you have not read it, or if they banned it from your school, because it is a book that is constantly challenged to be pulled out of curriculum or out of libraries, I highly recommend you read it. It sort of ranks up there. I'll say in at least the top five, sort of, great American novels. Um, so let's talk about what To Kill a Mockingbird is. All right, the main narrator is this young girl right here, named Scout, right? And she is a 6-year-old narrator, right? And this is sort of like semi-autobiographical as far as the location of the woman who wrote this book named Harper Lee. This is, yeah, sort of semi-autobiographical as far as like her hometown, all right? So she is the narrator, Scout, as a 6-year-old. Her father, Atticus, who's this gentleman right here, he's a lawyer and he is defending a black man who is convicted of raping a white woman. Right? We're talking about in the South. You're talking about the 1950s, 1940s. We know the context. All right. So he speaks to his children in these very adult ways. All right, but we also have to recognize that children sort of understanding the legal system, especially involving such a heinous crime as sexual assault, children aren't going to. You're not going to talk to a child about those situations in the same way you would talk to another adult about those situations. So again, when we talk about communication accommodation, we can think about the ways in which we talk to children versus the ways in which we talk to our peers versus the ways in which we talk to our grandparents. We can have similar conversations about current events, for instance, whatever's going on in the news, but we talk to each of those groups very differently as far as making sure that we are accommodating them in a way that is sort of age appropriate for whatever messages we're trying to share or have a conversation about. All right. So that's kind of what we're thinking here, right? Um, this book, To Kill a Mockingbird, also there's this sort of disconnect between upper middle class whites and sort of quote unquote white trash, right? I know it's not the kindest of language, but that's really the distinction they're trying to draw here, especially for the very racist people, sort of in this area in this book, right? So the book also looks at like how do you change language to illustrate these sort of class differences, right? So when different people in the book are talking to each other, there's ways in which we go back to our conversation on things like code switching, right? The ways in which I talk, it's going to change based on the culture that I'm around, the people that I'm talking to. The way in which I talk to other people within the professorial profession is different than people that my friends back home, right? Or my siblings. We're constantly changing the ways in which we communicate, even if we're talking about the same exact situation. So modern day situations, politics, the last election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, the BLM protest, the trial right now. We're about to have a verdict with the Derek Chauvin trial over the killing of George Floyd. Different people, the different people you talk to those individuals in different ways because of cultural background, because of age, etc. All right. So that's what this accommodation stuff is all about. All right. There's a very important foundational work in communication studies that you should just know that it exists. I've brought it up in some of my other classes. But the title of this article is called Speaking Like a Man in Teamsterville. It's written by Phillipson in 1975. And what Phillipson did, this is an actual research project. What Phillipson did was go to South Chicago and sort of did an ethnographic study within this white working class neighborhood, right? So there's this white working class neighborhood where everybody goes to the same high school. All the people you grew up with, they all end up marrying each other. All the guys end up going and working for the factory. The women are sort of either working at the local diners or they're stay-at-home moms. And that's sort of everybody in this community, right? South Chicago, white working class neighborhood in the 1970s, right? So Phillipson goes and just sort of researched the communication patterns of this neighborhood, as well as the ways in which the people in this neighborhood talk to each other, how they talk to people who are on the outside, like Phillipson was a researcher, and how do they talk to people within the community who, let's say, graduate high school, they go away to college, and then they come back to the community? How are they sort of talked to differently, right? So that's what Phillipson was looking at, and he found that people use different communication strategies to talk to different people at sort of different, at various levels of sort of in-group and out-group aspects of this community. Right. So again, we talk about, the one or two kids who might graduate high school and go off to college. They come back and they speak differently, right? And then the people in that community will say things like, oh, look at college boy, speaking properly now, speaking with proper grammar, right? Doesn't have the slang and the accent of sort of white working class South Chicago factory town. But then the college student, they might go away and they might they might speak what's considered more standard English, right? And then they come back home and they might speak in a sort of a college tone for like a day or two, but then eventually they sort of slip back into sort of white working class vocabulary, syntax, accent, etc. Right? So this is what Phillipson was looking at: the ways in which people were changing their communication strategies back and forth to talk to different people, right? Talk across differences, right? So just know that this article exists. It's an extremely important article, Speaking Like a Man in Teamsterville. All right, so kind of what I mentioned, I'll just read this definition out to us. During communication encounters, people will try to accommodate or adjust their style of speaking. This is primarily done in two ways: divergence and convergence. We'll talk about this in a second. Groups with strong cultural pride often use divergence to highlight group identity. So groups with strong cultural pride, they speak to people on the outside to highlight the differences, right? I speak in one way, I communicate in one way, I use certain language and vocabulary. I'm going to continue to sort of dig into that to show that I'm over here and you're over there, right? There is this divergence between cultures, right? Between backgrounds. Convergence occurs when there's a strong need for social improvement, frequently in powerless individuals. So if a person doesn't have a lot of power, let's say that they're new at a company, and let's say they come from a working class background, but now they're sort of moving into a white collar job, right? Those individuals converge, right? They're more likely to adapt and assimilate to the sort of white collar job that they're now a part of, and they sort of get rid of the former communication strategies that they had. So that they might drop an accent, they're going to speak more eloquently, right? They're going to converge into the more powerful sort of white collar job that they're getting. All right. So divergence. No, I'm not going to change. I'm going to sort of dig into whatever background I had as far as communication strategies, and I'm going to and yes, there are differences, but you are always going to be aware that you and I are from different backgrounds. Convergence. You and I are from different backgrounds, but there's ways in which we sort of either blend together, or if I have more power, you are going to figure out a way to assimilate because you want access to those powerful structures. All right. And then finally, just accommodation, adjusting one's behavior in response to others. So if you don't understand me, I might not need to know that I need to accommodate. But as you and I keep having a conversation, we're going to figure out different ways in which we're going to either one of us is going to strongly change the other one's communication strategies, or we're both going to kind of meld our communication strategies together in response to our ongoing conversations. All right, your identity is shaped by personal and social factors. So we create in-groups and out-groups. In-groups are groups that you belong to. Out-groups are groups that you don't belong to. Now, here's something that's very, very interesting with regard to in-group, out-groups. We communicate in a way to constantly show what groups we're a part of, right? And to show people who are outside the group that they're not a part of our group, right? So you can think about political identities, for instance. You might have a strong allegiance to, let's say, Joe Biden, right? And progressive policies, right? So you are constantly going to, you're going to just make it known by dropping a little tweet, putting up a little Facebook post, maybe just retweeting a story. So you don't even say anything original. You just sort of retweet a story that you saw off the Huffington Post that's, sort of very progressive in its politics or whatever, right? You do this for two reasons, right? The first is to let out groups know, like, you're not one of us. You're not a part of my group, right? I'm going to sort of virtue signal out, like, these are my politics, and I want you to know very much that you're not sort of in this group. And the other reason is to sort of show your in-group that you're safe, all right? So you're sort of reinforcing your allegiance to, the progressive policies, if that's the group you want to be a part of. So when it comes to what's known as virtue signaling, what research has shown is that when it comes to sort of speaking your political beliefs out loud, you're actually not doing it to shame people who don't agree with you. You're actually saying your politics out loud, not because you want to convince people on the other side of the aisle that, like, I'm trying to persuade you to come over, but people speak their politics out loud to show that the in-group tribe that they have decided to be a part of, people shout their politics out loud to let their political party know that I am a strong person in this political party and don't kick me out of the group. So when we outwardly talk about our beliefs and our values, they are for the benefit of the group we're already a part of, because we are somewhere subconsciously scared of being kicked out of the group that we've become a part of. So when you talk about, like, faith testimonies in religious institutions, when people openly talk about their faith, they are less likely doing it because they want to convert people to the faith. They are more likely outwardly talking about the faith to let other people of faith around them know, like, I want to be a part of this group. I want to be a part of this group so much that I'm constantly going to talk about this group. Please don't kick me out of this group, right? So because people are social animals, human beings are social animals, we need strong in-groups that we're a part of, whether it's a sports team, whether it's political identity, religious identity, if there's some sort of academic discipline that you get really involved in, if it's some sort of extracurricular book club, right? Some sort of fraternal organization, American Legion, the Lions Club, the Elk Club, right? These sort of small town, groups that your grandparents might be involved with, right? When we speak outwardly in favor of these ideas, we are doing so as a way of showing that group that I am strongly committed to the group. Please don't kick me out. So this is what becomes so dangerous when it comes to individuals who push back against their own political party. All right. So let's say that you're a Democrat, and for the most part, you don't like Republican policies. So you're going to sit there as a Democrat and say bad things about the Republican Party a lot and talk a lot about how great Democrat policies are, right? You're doing that to show the Democrat Party people, keep me in your group. I need a political tribe to be a part of. I can't be by myself, right? Now, this is what gets interesting. Most people, let's just go with the Democrat Party, right? Example for a second. Let's say I'm a member of the Democrat Party, but I think that Donald Trump had a better immigration policy. So I'm like, look, I'm a Democrat who I think, minimum wage should be higher and there should be more gun control. But, the immigration thing at the border right now, it's out of control. Donald Trump actually had a better plan for immigration. Fewer people were coming in illegally. Like it seemed a lot more organized. Right now, it just seems very, very chaotic, and the Democrat Party is doing a bad job with immigration. I will not say that out loud if I'm a part of the Democrat Party, right? Most people won't. And the reason is because if I'm a part of that Democrat Party in group, if there's one thing that I disagree with, most people are going to be quiet about it because they don't want to get kicked out of the Democrat Party, right? And the same is true if you're a Republican. Republicans aren't going to speak out against their party publicly because people are going to kick them out of the party, right? So most people politically are like 70-30 when it comes to their political beliefs. If I'm a Democrat, it's like I probably believe like 70% of the Democrat platform and only like 30% of the Republican platform, right? I don't agree with either party 100%. Nobody does. But when people get on TV and talk about their party and their allegiance to the party, they act as if their party is 100% correct on all issues. Because if I'm a Democrat spokesperson, I can't get on TV and say, hey, the Republicans actually have a good idea over here, because I'm going to get kicked out of my group. If I'm a Republican, I can't say, look, I think the Republican Party is great, but I disagree with this one policy, because I'm going to get kicked out of the Republican Party. And we see this happen every now and again in the news. There's always a story about a politician who gets kicked out of their party for a while because they said one thing against their party. Like there's 100 policy issues, and it's like, well, there's 100. I agree with 99 of them, but there's like one issue I disagree with. If you say that out loud, you're going to get kicked out of your tribe, right? You're going to get kicked out of your political party, right? So again, when most people speak publicly about issues, they are doing so as a way to virtue signal to their in-group. I will always 100% of the time stand behind the tribe, stand behind the political party, stand behind the family. I'm never going to air our dirty laundry out in public, all right? Even though we all know that we don't 100% agree with every policy with whatever group we're in, all right? People who are Republicans, they don't 100% agree with the Republican platform. People who are Democrats don't 100% agree with the Democrat platform. But politicians will never say that out loud, because they know if they say anything out loud against their political tribe, they're going to get kicked out of the party. So when people get on TV and talk, they cannot give credit to the other side. All right, and this is why we have such deep divisions politically. All right. It'd be kind of great every once in a while if, a Democrat would get on stage and be like, hey, I'm a Democrat, here's all my pop. But, I think my leadership messed up and the Republicans actually, they have a really good bill and we should probably side with them this time, right? Or vice versa. That'd be fantastic. But it doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is because if you're that one person who stands against your party on an issue, you're going to get kicked out of the party, all right? So you don't want to do that. Well, you should do that, but a lot of people don't want to do that because we want to be a part of our in-group, all right? So when you post things on Facebook, when you tweet stuff out or anybody does, most of the time they are virtues. They're not doing it because they want to yell at the people who disagree with him. Most people post stuff because they want a virtue signal to the in-groups they're already a part of. I'm a safe person. Still like me. Please like me. Please don't hate me. Please, let me be a part of the group. I constantly have to show my loyalty to the group that I want to be involved with. Okay. So there's a little exercise we would have done in class, right? Think about the ways in which your identity is shaped by different social factors, right? Think about some different groups you belong in and think about some distinct characteristics of that group and how that group is, what makes that group unique, all right? So if sports team, religious organization, political organization, think about the ways in which your identity is shaped by those in-groups that you're a part of, and think about the ways in which you might feel uncomfortable speaking out against the group, even if you think the group has kind of messed up a little bit here and there. All right. So we all feel this pressure to constantly defend the groups that have taken us in. Very few people will outwardly speak, will speak out against groups that they're a part of. Because it's scary to say, this group took me in, I'm a part of no other group, and if I speak out against my group, they're going to kick me out and I'm going to be homeless, right? We like our social groups. So we are overly accommodating. We usually defend the groups. Even if we disagree with them, we kind of go along with it. We nod our head. We might lie a little bit because, we don't want to be kicked out of the group. All right. We adjust communication based on assumptions, whether or not they're right or wrong. All right. So, for instance, there's this little part in the textbook I used to use where we have this conversation where they show a conversation between grandma and a granddaughter, right? And so grandma is trying to like understand her, like, kind of punk rock, goth, teenager, whatever, granddaughter, right? So the grandma says, like, why do you always wear black? It looks like you're going to a funeral. And the granddaughter says, like, your generation just doesn't understand teenagers. And then the grandma kind of comes back with like, well, like we had fun, like, but you wouldn't understand the way in which we had fun. So this whole conversation between two different generations, what it shows is that we are adjusting our communication based on assumptions, and intergenerational disagreements or misunderstandings, those assumptions are usually kind of wrong. All right, so this is a good one with regard to whether or not your grandparents had fun. And young people, it's like, it's our new music, it's the movies, it's pop culture. It's like music and pop culture existed for your grandparents too. They can empathize with it, right? They might not like, whoever the new artist is, but it's like they had their versions of new artists and pop culture and what was super cool, like back when they were growing up as well. All right. So there's this perceived generational gap that makes it makes it difficult for grandparents and grandchildren to communicate with each other. So there's a difference in topic, right? Your grandparents listen to one type of music, you listen to another type of music, right? But both of you understand the need to want to be on board with like what's the newest music when you're 20 years old. So your grandparents felt that pressure when they were 20 years old, right? Your grandparents wanted to, dress in the newest styles and whatever was trendy. Like they had those pressures and they did those things, right? But their music was just different than your music. But the sort of emotions around why it is we gravitate to certain music or pop culture trends, that's the same, all right? And it's all about being a part of like what's new and trendy, and sort of rejecting what's like old and not trendy. All right. And so here we go. Like grandparents actually know a lot about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. In some ways, if it might have been your grandparents, if not your grandparents, maybe your parents, depending on how old they are, right? But yeah, this whole like sex, drug, and rock and roll thing, it's like, where do you think that came from, right? 1950s, 1960s, right? Like rock and roll's kind of exploding, right? Woodstock and that 1960s, 1970s hippies. It's like modern day drug as far as like how we understand it. Where do you think all that stuff came from? It's like, it's your parents or your grandparents. Sexual liberation in the 1960s. It's like, who do you think was on college campus, being very open with conversations about sexuality? It's like 1960s. Let me do a little bit of math on how old my parents or my grandparents are, and it's there you have it. All right. So you and you and the older generation have a lot more in common with regard to wanting to buck tradition and try to be cool and hip and everything else. All right, know the difference between these two ideas, right? So we talked about there's two ways in which people who are having some difficulties communicating with each other, we can either converge or we can diverge. All right. So convergence is adapting my behavior to the person that I'm talking to. So the example that they used to give in the textbook is if a friend comes to me and says, "Oh, I cannot smoke in my apartment," right? Even if I disagree with my friend a little bit and I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like converging is, you know what? Like I'm going to be supportive and I'm going to sort of mold my communication strategies to be empathetic to my friend, because right now my friend needs someone to listen to them and empathize with them, and that person doesn't need to be scolded at the moment, even if I disagree with it. So you probably have friends that you disagree with on certain topics, but you realize that this isn't the time to fight, and my friend doesn't want to hear a lecture. My friend just wants to feel supportive. supported. So you go along and you support your friend, right? So in a convergence, you adapt. So if your friend says like, I cannot smoke in my apartment, you say, that sucks. Like, I'm sorry to hear that. Like, it sounds like it's very, very hard for you. And you speak in a way that's supportive of your friend. Divergence is you resist. All right. So if a friend says, oh, I cannot smoke in my apartment, now you resist. You're not going to accommodate the empathetic state that they're in, right? Or that they need, right? And so you kind of resist. You say, well, maybe that's okay. It's not your property. Like this, not smoking in an apartment, like that seems like that's a decision that the landlord gets to make. And I'm sorry to hear that, but this isn't your choice. All right. So that's resisting the empathy that they want, or that's resisting the accommodation that they want from you. Over accommodation, and we'll have some more fun examples on the next slide, right? Is overly agreeing or disagreeing, right? Overly agreeing or being or adapting. And you sort of, when people go overboard, you might be a little bit jarring because you realize like this seems a little extra, right? Maybe you need to calm down. So if someone says, oh, I can't smoke in my apartment, and you have people who go way over the top emotionally and say like, what, this is America, you should be free to do whatever you want. You're like, okay, calm down. Like we're not talking about, 1776 here. We're talking about, smoking in an apartment. So people who go way overboard, they try to overly accommodate. That can happen sometimes, right? So you want to make sure that you are tempering the ways in which you are using communication strategies, right? You don't want to sort of be, overly agreeable or overly divergent. You got to find the right balance. So let's talk about over accommodation specifically with politicians, because what's more fun to pick on than politicians? So over accommodation with politicians. So I'll look at these little memes over here first, right? So this is I'll read it for you because some of the words get cut off in the design part, right? So this says, not sure which is worse, politicians trying to be cool or people who want them to be, right? So what's worse, a politician who's trying to be super cool, or people want their politicians to be cool, right? And that's a pretty good exercise. Politicians who are trying to be overly cool, when you're just like, I just want you to be a really smart person who can like figure out, foreign and domestic policy and just be wonky. Like I like my politicians to be very, very boring people. I don't need to see them on cable news all the time. Politicians who go into politics to sort of be cable news celebrities and hang out with like, Jay-Z and Beyonce is very, very weird to me. I don't want a politician who does that. But there you have it, right? So politicians sort of get over accommodating and trying to sort of be amongst the people, right? Down here we have a picture of Ted Cruz as a senator in Texas. And there was this thing that was going on in Texas a few years back. They do this thing, I'm sure that people still do it. It's called machine gun bacon, right? And he was doing a fundraiser where people were creating what's called machine gun bacon. And what you do is you take raw bacon, you wrapped it around the end of, whatever, gun you're, going to go to the shooting range with. You fire off a few rounds. The end of the barrel gets hot. It cooks the bacon, and then you eat the bacon off, the end of the gun. It's very ridiculous, right? And so politicians sort of get into this like weird little cultural things to sort of show people, I'm going to behave in a way that you all are behaving to be a part of the crowd. This happens every year, or not every 4 years at the Iowa State Fair. All the politicians go to the Iowa State Fair because Iowa is the first caucus that votes in the presidential election. So you see all these politicians who are sort of like Ivy League graduates, suit and tie all the time, and then they end up at the Iowa State Fair and they dress down a little bit. They're eating like, fried Oreos. Some of them look pretty normal doing it, right? Like George Bush definitely had that like cowboy feel to him, down in Texas. So he could go to the Iowa State Fair and it feels pretty normal that he's there. Some people maybe like Hilary Clinton just seems a little out of place, right? She's a little too buttoned up for the last 30 years, and just doesn't feel as genuine sort of in these very sort of like Midwestern county fair atmospheres. All right. So over accommodation can happen with regard to politicians where they just sort of go over bounds, they sort of go over the top. Some of this stuff will happen when you see politicians campaigning and they end up at a bar and they're sitting there, drinking a beer or taking shots, with a couple people to sort of say like, hey, this is our local beer, and a politician will sit there and drink it with everybody. Some of them look like they've had a beer before. Some of them look like they haven't had a beer before, and it looks rather awkward. So you can kind of tell how this works. There's definitely moments where politicians sort of overstep. I'm trying the couple later examples. I guess this goes to like 2020. Vice President Kamala Harris, when she was running for the vice presidency, she was, or maybe it might have been when she was still in the presidential campaign. But she was on some sort of hip hop in the morning radio show, and she started to talk about sort of like early '90s rap music, like he's talking about like listening. And she was like, yeah, I went to college listening to Tupac, and then yeah, people kind of did some research and like you went to college in the '80s before Tupac was like an artist. So she's sort of talking about music and when she listened to it and stuff, and it just like the dates were kind of out of step. And it's like, does she have Tupac on her playlist? Perhaps, but the ways in which sort of like overly accommodating the needs of people to sort of show that you're a part of the in group just seems a little bit forced. All right, so there you have it. All right, I do have a YouTube clip here. I'll put it down below. Fair warning, it's extremely offensive, but it's Hilary Clinton from 2008. And the short version is that she was supposed to be the presidential nominee in 2008. A no-name nobody named Barack Obama started to gain on her, right? She's winning, and then they're about to go down to the southern primary states, places like South Carolina and stuff, because she feels Barack Obama starting to gain some steam. And when they go down south, the Democrat primaries are sort of overwhelmingly African American, right? So places like Iowa, New Hampshire, some of the first ones, very much, all white people in that state for the most part. Start going down south, a place like South Carolina, it's like, okay, a big population here in the Democrat primary voting is going to be African Americans. So Hillary Clinton goes down there. She feels the heat of Barack Obama, and she's like, hey, African American presidential candidate. We're going into sort of states that are more the citizens who are voting are more African American. She's like, I really need to connect with African Americans. So she kind of needs to bring back some of that Bill Clinton, remind them like Bill Clinton was this like guy who did a lot of stuff for the African American community in the 90s. I'm his wife. Like she was trying to sort of overly accommodate and remind Black Americans what, Bill Clinton did for them in the 90s. And she goes to this church and she starts to get a little, she falls into this ridiculous, over the top, outdated, stereotypical African American Southern preacher voice when she's behind the podium. There's a YouTube clip of it here where she's sort of quoting words from a civil rights activist, and she says this line, I don't feel no ways tired, but she really puts it on. And you can watch her do it, and you can say that seems like you're trying a little too hard now. All right, you've sort of crossed the line from being empathetic with a community to this seems offensive to the community now. And so politicians are kind of always on this line where I think it's perfectly fine to sort of, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? When you go and you're a part of another culture, or you're, kind of trying to, when you're not a part of a group, but you want to, be respectful of that group and, go in and learn about, a culture and, taste food and learn dances and sing songs that are a part of that culture. There's ways to do it that are respectful, right? To say like, I want to assimilate for a while to kind of try out, new cultural things with, in a respectful mean. And then there's sometimes when people get a little too comfortable a little too soon with being in a culture, and it sort of goes downhill and it looks very offensive very, very quickly. So if you would like to see Hillary Clinton in 2008 put on a accent that seems a little bit just stepping over the line, you go ahead and watch this YouTube clip. Okay, that's all I have for communication accommodation. I'll see you all next time.